If you grew up near a British farm in the years after the war, you remember the sound of a field marshal, even if you never knew its name. The slow, heavy thump of a single enormous cylinder rolling across the fields on threshing day, a tractor so powerful it rocked on its own tires as it idled. Marshall of Gainsborough had been building engines since 1848 on a site that grew to employ 5,000 people and shipped its machines to Russia, Australia, and the ends of the earth. They survived the death of steam, survived a works fire, 2 world wars, and a bankruptcy that should have finished them. They came back every time. And then, after more than a century of making, the thump stopped, and the great works fell silent. How does a firm that survived all of that simply disappear? What happened at Gainsborough? Chapter 1. The Man from Backstreet. The story starts by a river. Gainsborough sits on the Trent, up in the flat-top corner of Lincolnshire, and in 1848 it was a market town that moved corn and coal along the water and did little else the wider world would notice. That year, a millwright came home. His name was William Marshall. He'd been born in the town, learned his trade with his hands, and then gone away to Manchester, the loudest, fastest, most modern place in the country, where he'd worked as an agent for William Fairbairn and Sons, one of the great engineering names of the age. He had seen what iron and steam could do at scale. And now, in middle life, with a second wife and 2 grown sons, he came back to the quiet town on the Trent and bought a dead business. It was a small thing. The millwright's shop of the late William Garland on Back Street, gone still after its owner's death. Marshall took it on, and almost at once he did something that tells you the whole measure of the man. He renamed it, a modest foundry in a Lincolnshire market town, and he called it the Britannia Iron Works. Britannia, the figure of the nation herself, seated with her shield and her trident. It was an enormous name to hang over a small yard, and Marshall meant every letter of it. He wasn't building a workshop. He was making a promise about what the workshop would become. He didn't build it alone. His son James came in as a partner in 1849, and the firm became William Marshall and Son. 4 years later, the second son, Henry Dickinson Marshall, joined them too. In 1855, the family bought a stretch of land off Beaumont Street, the ground on which the real works would rise, and they made their own bricks on site to build it. Then, in 1861, William Marshall died. He'd had 13 years. He'd seen the promise begin, and no more than begin. His sons carried it. In 1862, they turned the firm into a limited company, and under James and Henry, the Britannia Iron Works started to grow in a way their father might have dreamed of, but never watched. The numbers tell the climb better than any adjective. In 1861, the year William died, the works employed 21 men and 10 boys, 31 souls. By 1871, it was 521 men and 85 boys. By 1881, close to 1,400 men and another 137 boys. In 20 years, a foundry of 30-odd hands had become a small industrial town of its own. And a town it genuinely was, because the works began to reshape the place around it. So many men poured into Gainsborough looking for work at Marshall's that the town simply ran out of houses. There weren't enough homes for the wage packets the works was handing out. So in 1876, James and Henry Marshall did something that a modern employer would file under welfare and a Victorian one filed under common sense. They founded the Gainsborough Building Society so that the men who made the engines could buy the roofs over their heads. By the end of 1885, the brick buildings, Marshall's own bricks, off Marshall's own land, covered 11.5 acres of a 16-acre site, and 1,900 men clocked in through the gates. The foundry on Back Street was a memory. What stood in its place was one of the great engineering works of Victorian England, and every last piece of it ran on steam. The engines that made Gainsborough famous ran on steam, and steam was about to make the family very rich indeed, before it turned round and quietly began to betray them. Chapter 2. An Empire of Steam. To understand what Marshall's became, you have to understand what it sold and to whom, because this was never a firm that lived off its own back doorstep. Lincolnshire was a farming county, and Gainsborough was one of a cluster of Lincolnshire towns. Lincoln itself, Grantham down the road, that turned themselves into the machine shop of world agriculture. The home market was small. Marshall looked outward from the very start. They built portable steam engines, the workhorse of the Victorian farm, an engine on wheels you could haul from field to field behind a team of horses to drive a threshing drum or a saw bench. From 1876, they built traction engines, the great self-propelled beasts that could pull their own weight, and a train of wagons besides. They built steamrollers, and in that trade, Marshall stood second in all of Britain only to Aveling and Porter. They built stationary engines and boilers up to 500 horsepower, and, in a line that tells you exactly how far this Lincolnshire firm was reaching, they built tea manufacturing machinery for the plantations of India and Ceylon. The reach was extraordinary for its day. An order came in from Russia for railway equipment before the firm was even 10 years old. Traction engines went out to New Zealand, to Australia, to Brazil, to Germany. In the 10 years between 1878 and 1887, the works turned out 310 traction engines, and 71 of those crossed an ocean to get to work. In 1873, at the Vienna Universal Exhibition, Marshall took a gold medal. A firm born in a dead man's yard on Back Street was now winning prizes on the great stages of Europe and shipping its engines to the ends of the earth. The scale kept climbing. By 1907, the workforce was around 3,600. Annual sales crossed £1 million by 1916, a colossal figure for the time. Marshall's had become, by some accounts of the period, the largest factory complex in Europe. That was a claim the town was proud to make, and one you should hold at arm's length. It was the kind of boast that grew in the telling. But the truth underneath the boast was solid enough. This was a giant. Then came the war, and the giant turned its hands to it. During the First World War, the workforce swelled to around 5,000 as the works poured out munitions, and in 1917, Marshall opened an entirely new site on Lee Road, the Carhouse Works, to build aircraft, farm engines one day, fighting aeroplanes the next. That was the range of the place at its height, but the works had already had its warning. In May 1914, before the war even began, fire tore through the Britannia Iron Works. For a firm built of its own brick and iron, a serious fire was a body blow, and Marshall's took it, rebuilt, and carried on. It survived the flames. It survived the war. What it could not survive, it turned out, was peace. Because when the guns fell silent in 1918, the world stopped buying steam. The traction engine, the portable, the great stationary boiler, the whole magnificent catalogue that had built Gainsborough, was suddenly old. The internal combustion engine was coming, lighter and cleaner and cheaper, and the export markets that had carried Marshall's for 70 years began to dry up one by one. The firm was not blind to it. As early as 1906, Marshall had already built its first internal combustion tractor, the big petrol-paraffin machines they called the Colonial, rated at anything from 16 to 32 horsepower, 300 and more of them shipped out to the wheat prairies of Australia, New Zealand and Canada before the war shut the line down. Marshall knew the future had an engine in it that didn't run on coal. The question was, which engine? And to answer it, the men of Gainsborough did something their gold medal Victorian founders might have found strange. They looked to Germany, because in Germany, one particular tractor was quietly conquering the farms of the world, and it ran on a single, enormous, thumping cylinder. Chapter 3. The One-Cylinder Gamble. The German machine was the land's bulldog, and it was a phenomenon. Simple, crude, almost impossible to break, cheap to run on the roughest fuel a farmer could pour into it. The bulldog sold in its hundreds of thousands, and it did it all on one big, slow cylinder. To an engineer at Gainsborough, watching the steam order book collapse, the lesson looked obvious. Simplicity sold. One cylinder sold. Marshall would build a one-cylinder oil engine of its own. But first, the firm nearly died. In 1934, with the steam trade gone and a farming slump biting hard, Marshall, Sons and Company went into receivership. The great works that had shipped engines to Russia and taken gold in Vienna ran out of money. It looked, for a moment, like the end. It wasn't. In October 1935, the scrap and engineering combine Thomas W. Ward Limited of Sheffield bought the entire assets and kept 930 men in work. The firm was reorganized the following year as Marshall, Sons and Company Successors Limited, with 5 ward directors sitting on the board. A Sheffield man, Ashley Skelton Ward, would come to chair both companies. The Marshall name survived, but from 1935 onward, it survived as something owned, the first hand in a long line of hands the firm would be passed between. Under Ward money, though, the one-cylinder gamble went ahead, and here Marshall made a choice that would define everything that followed, and that most people to this day get wrong. The German Bulldog was a hot bulb engine. It didn't fully compress and ignite its fuel the way a proper diesel does. It needed a blow lamp played on the cylinder head to warm a bulb before it would fire. Marshall looked at that and decided to do the harder, better, cleverer thing. They would build a true diesel, full compression, no blow lamp, a real oil engine of the modern kind, wrapped around a single giant cylinder. The first of them was the 1530, the Model E, which appeared in 1930. It was a horizontal single-cylinder, 2-stroke diesel with a bore of 8 inches and a stroke of 10.5, the best part of 8 litres of engine turning over at barely 550 revolutions a minute, hauling the whole tractor along at 5 miles an hour flat out. It was enormous, it was slow, and it was troublesome. The early ones were plagued with reliability problems. But Marshall learned. The 1830 followed in 1932. Then, in the mid-30s, came the machine that pointed the way, the 1220, smaller and lighter and cheaper. Its cylinder shrunk to a bore of 6.5 inches and a stroke of 9, spinning up to 700 revs. That basic engine, that size, that shape, was the one. Refined into the Model M from 1938, it soldiered right through the Second World War, ploughing the fields of a country that suddenly, desperately, needed every acre it had. And that is the machine that came out of the war and got a new name. A name borrowed with a straight face from the highest rank in the British Army. In June 1945, as the country stood exhausted and victorious and hungry, Marshall of Gainsborough put its single-cylinder diesel into a fresh set of clothes, painted it Brunswick green, and called it the Field Marshal. It would become the most beloved tractor Britain ever built, and it was, from the day it launched, already the past. Chapter 4. Thump, thump, thump. Picture the machine itself, because there has never been anything quite like it before or since. One cylinder. Just one, but what a cylinder. Horizontal, water-cooled, a bore of 6.5 inches and a stroke of 9, somewhere between 5 and 6 litres of 2-stroke diesel, making around 40 horsepower at a leisurely 700-odd turns a minute. All of it hung on the side of a flywheel the size of a cartwheel. Everything about it was slow and huge and deliberate, and that single vast piston is the root of the whole legend, because it created a problem that Marshall solved in the maddest way any British engineer ever solved anything. You could not start it by hand. The piston was simply too big, the compression too fierce, for a man to crank it over from cold against the resistance. So how did a farmer, alone in a cold yard on a January morning, bring 5 litres of stubborn diesel to life? He got out a shotgun cartridge and a hammer. This is the part everyone half remembers and almost everyone gets wrong. So here is what actually happened, step by step. First, the farmer took a special slow-burning paper, soaked in saltpeter, lit it until it glowed, and screwed it into a holder in the cylinder head. That smouldering paper was not a flame thrown into the engine. That was the Lance trick, the hot bulb blow lamp, and the Marshall was a very different beast. The glowing paper simply sat there as an ember, a source of heat waiting to help that first charge catch. Then came the cartridge, a purpose-made blank starting cartridge, the size of a 12-bore shotgun shell, and this is where the story gets embroidered, because it was never live shot, never a fired pellet, just a case full of powder. The farmer screwed it into a breech on the side of the engine and shut the breech tight. He turned the flywheel to just the right spot, a fraction before the top of the stroke, and then he took a hammer and he struck the firing pin. The cartridge went off like a gun. The blast drove that great piston down through its stroke, the glowing paper caught the fuel, compression did the rest, and the engine boomed into life in a ring of smoke and settled into the sound that a generation of British farm children would never forget. Thump, 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 slow and heavy, and utterly distinctive. The beat of a single enormous cylinder firing once, pausing, firing again. It came out of a tall exhaust stack and rolled across the fields for half a mile, and the tractor moved as it beat. At idle, the whole machine visibly rocked on its rubber tires, juddering back and forth as if it were straining at a leash. Left ticking over on soft ground and forgotten, a field marshal could literally shake itself down into the earth. One preservationist, Peter Watkin, would remember being pulled across a field as a boy by that strange thumping sound, unable to stay away from it. It was the sound of the harvest. It was the sound of the machine that everyone loved. There was, it should be said, a gentler way in. On a warm engine, or a mild morning with a fit pair of arms behind it, a field marshal could be started with a crank handle, helped enormously by a clever decompression system, a spiral groove machined into the flywheel rim that held the compression off for 3 revolutions, sometimes 6, letting the flywheel gather speed before the pressure snapped back and the engine fired. Cartridges cost money, after all. 2 bob a pop, farmers remembered, which added up. The crank was for good days. The cartridge was for the cold ones, when nothing else would do. But the cartridge start had a dark side, and the truth of it deserves telling straight. Firing those charges over and over caked the engine in carbon, which jammed the very decompression valve the crank starting relied on. And it could hurt you. At a museum in Australia there is a documented account of a man, his name was Hugh, who fired a cartridge that fizzed instead of banging. Thinking it a dud, he loaded a second and fired that. But the first charge's powder hadn't burned. It had dropped down into the starting chamber, and the second detonation set the whole lot off at once. The blast blew the cast iron chamber apart. It took his left arm off at the elbow and wrecked his right. That is the one true, named account of the danger, and it is enough. Marshall built the Field Marshal across a decade of steady improvement. The Series 1 of 1945 gave way to the Series 2 in 1947, with 40 horsepower and a bigger clutch and better brakes. Around 7,000 of them made, the best seller of the whole family. Then the Series 3, with a proper high and low gearbox, and, at last, a hydraulic 3-point linkage. And finally, from 1952, the Series 3A, repainted from that dignified green to a bright, hopeful orange to make it look modern. Around 2,000 of those, shipped out to Australia and Argentina and France. By the time the single-cylinder line ended, Marshall had built somewhere close to 14,000 of them. 14,000 thumping, banging, rocking, unburstable machines. And every farmer who owned one loved it. That was the tragedy waiting in the wings. Because loving a thing has never once been the same as it being right. Chapter 5. The Sound of the Harvest. For a few years, though, it truly was the sound of the harvest, and it arrived at exactly the right moment. In June 1945, Britain was a country that had learned, the hard way, that it could not feed itself and had better start trying. Before the war, there had been around 56,000 tractors working the fields of England and Wales. By 1945, there were more than 180,000. The horse was going, the engine was coming, and the government put its whole weight behind the change. The Agriculture Act of 1947, passed under Attlee's government, its farming brief in the hands of the minister Tom Williams, did something a British farmer had never known before. It guaranteed prices. It assured markets. It told a man with land that if he invested in machinery and grew the food, the state would make sure it was worth his while. And so the men bought machines. Within a few years, Britain was the most mechanized farming country in Europe, and Gainsborough was building the tractor that made the deepest impression of all. For the men on the Marshall floor, this was the good time, and it sat on top of generations of good times. These were multi-generational families, fathers and sons and grandsons through the same gates, apprenticeships recorded from the 1870s onward, the building society that let them own their homes, the whole town organized around the rhythm of the works. When a lad started at Marshall's, he was joining something his family had helped build for the better part of a century, and the tractor they sent out earned its reputation honestly. Farmers found the Field Marshal robust, powerful, and astonishingly cheap to run on rough fuel. But its real magic was as a stationary engine. Drive it from farm to farm, park it beside the threshing drum, throw a long flat leather belt over the flywheel, and that single unhurried cylinder would drive a threshing machine or a saw bench all day without complaint. The contracting men, the ones who moved their gear from farm to farm through the harvest, adored it for exactly that. Nothing had torque like a big single. Nothing was harder to stall. Starting it was such a performance that they simply left it running all day, thumping away in the corner of the yard, a machine that announced itself for half a mile in every direction. Stand in that yard in 1949, and you would have every reason to think Gainsborough had reinvented itself perfectly. The steam empire had died, and the firm had refused to die with it. It had gambled on one cylinder and won the love of a nation's farmers. The works was busy, the town was working, and out across 10,000 English fields the thump of the field marshal was the very sound of a country getting back on its feet. But it was expensive. That was the fact, sitting quietly under all the affection, and it would not stay quiet. A field marshal cost about twice what a Fordson cost, the standard machine around £625, a contractor's deluxe model well over £800, against a Fordson you could have for little more than half that. The men who loved the marshal loved it enough to pay. But the great mass of ordinary British farmers, buying their first tractor with careful money in a careful time, were about to be offered something else entirely. Something light, something cheap, something so clever that it would make the magnificent, thumping, cartridge-fired field marshal look, almost overnight, like a museum piece that hadn't yet been told. It was already out there. It had gone into production in a factory near Coventry the summer before, and its maker had spent 30 years and a bitter fortune getting it exactly, ruthlessly right. Nobody standing in that Gainsborough yard in 1949 wanted to hear it, but the sound of the harvest was already, quietly, becoming the sound of the past. His name was Harry Ferguson, and his little grey tractor was going to change everything. Chapter 6. The Little Grey Threat. On the 6th of July, 1946, in a factory at Banner Lane on the edge of Coventry, the first of a new kind of tractor rolled off the line. It was small, it was light, it was painted a plain, unglamorous grey, and it would end the world that Gainsborough had just so carefully rebuilt. The man behind it was Harry Ferguson, an Ulsterman of ferocious stubbornness, who had spent the better part of 30 years chasing a single idea. He had watched horses and early tractors drag ploughs across fields, and he had understood something the industry hadn't, that the tractor and the implement behind it should not be two separate things dragging at each other, but one machine. His answer was hydraulics, a three-point linkage that lifted the plough, controlled its depth, and let the tractor and the tool work together as a single body. It was called the Ferguson system, and it was one of the most important advances in the history of farming. The little grey Fergie, the TE20, put all of it into a package a modest farmer could actually afford, around 20 horsepower, 4 cylinders, smooth and easy. It started on the turn of a key, and it cost roughly half what a field marshal cost. Set the two machines side by side in 1947, and the contest was already over, though it would take years for everyone to admit it. On one side, a heavy, costly, single-cylinder monster, you started by hitting a shotgun cartridge with a hammer and preheating with a smouldering paper. On the other, a light, cheap, brilliantly clever machine, you started with a key and drove home the same afternoon. The numbers, when they came, were merciless. By the time the last TE20 was built in 1956, Ferguson had made 517,651 of them. Marshall, across the entire life of its single-cylinder tractor, built around 14,000. For every field marshal that thumped out of Gainsborough, Ferguson built more than 30 little grey tractors, and Ferguson was not alone. The Fordson Major arrived in 1945. Nuffield came in. David Brown, international harvester. The whole industry was moving to light, multi-cylinder, easy-starting machines, and the ordinary British farmer went with them. Here is the hard question, and it deserves an honest answer. Why did Marshall keep building the single cylinder for another decade, right up to 1956? Not out of stupidity. The men at Gainsborough weren't fools. They kept building it because it still sold, to the contractors who loved its unstallable torque, to the export markets in Australia and Argentina and France who wanted a machine that would run on anything and never break. There was real loyalty out there and real money in it. The single cylinder had a genuine, defensible niche, but a niche is a small room, and the mainstream had walked out of it. While Ferguson and Ford were selling tractors to the whole country by the 100,000, Marshall was selling a beloved specialist machine to the few who still wanted one. The love was real. The market was not. Marshall's engineers could see it. They knew by the early 1950s that the age of the great single was ending, and they needed a modern tractor to replace it. They were right about the problem. In 1954, they set about solving it, and they gave the world precisely the wrong answer. Chapter 7. The six-cylinder mistake. The logic seemed sound at the time, which is what makes it a tragedy rather than a blunder. Marshall knew the single cylinder was finished. It knew it needed a modern tractor with more than one cylinder. But designing a whole new engine from scratch was expensive and slow, so Marshall decided to buy one in and build a big tractor around it. The project began in 1953 as the MP4, planned around a four-cylinder Meadows diesel. Then somebody judged that it needed more power. So Marshall switched to a six-cylinder Leyland diesel of around 70 horsepower, and the machine became the MP6, announced in November 1954. It was built along the lines of the Fowler Challenger crawler with a great hull-shaped chassis. It was powerful. It was substantial. It was, in every sense that mattered, wrong. Because 70 horsepower in the mid-1950s was enormous. Far too much tractor for the small, hedged, awkward fields of British farms. The MP6 was a machine built for the wide open acres of America, and Marshall had almost no way to sell it there. Full production didn't even begin until around 1956, by which time the moment had passed. The early ones suffered cracked rear bull gear housings, a fault that did nothing for a reputation the tractor never had time to build. The final tally is one of the saddest numbers in the whole story. Marshall built 197 MP6 tractors. All but 10 of them were exported, because there was scarcely anyone in Britain who wanted a machine that size. 197. Against Ferguson's 500,000, it is barely a rounding error, and there is a coda to the MP6 that says everything about the gap between what a thing is worth and what it earns. Decades later, one of the surviving prototypes, the very last of the MP4 to MP6 conversions, came up for auction at Sheffins. It sold for £66,500. The machine that failed so completely in its own time had become a curio worth a small fortune, valued far more by collectors mourning a lost era than it had ever been valued by the farmers it was built for. With the MP6 failure, something quiet and final happened at Gainsborough. Marshall stopped designing tractors. The firm that had gambled on one cylinder and won a nation's affection, then gambled on six and lost, simply stepped away from the game. From here on, the story is no longer about what Marshall made. It is about who owned it, and about the long, slow passing of a great name from hand to hand, each pair of hands a little further from Gainsborough, a little further from the men on the floor. Chapter 8. Passed from hand to hand. Thomas W. Ward had rescued Marshall in 1935, and for a while the arrangement held its shape. But an owned company drifts, and over the following decades the Marshall name was gathered up, folded in, reorganized, and eventually swallowed whole. The first move looked like strength. In 1947, Marshall bought John Fowler and Company of Leeds, a famous name in its own right, builders of ploughing engines and crawlers. Out of that marriage came the tracked versions of the Field Marshall, the Fowler VF and the Challenger, and eventually the whole Track Marshall crawler line. It was a genuine addition, but it also meant two proud old firms now shared a fate, and when the fate turned bad, it would take both down together. Through the late 1960s, the Marshall Group was pulled fully into the Thomas W. Ward organization, trading from around 1969 as Marshall Fowler Limited. Then, in the early 1970s, the Leeds works closed and everything was concentrated at Gainsborough. A century of Fowler history in Leeds ended, and the men there went home. Consolidation always sounds tidy in a boardroom. On the ground, it means gates closing and families losing wages. In September 1975 came the biggest hand of all. British Leyland, the sprawling, troubled, state-backed giant of British motor manufacturing, bought the Gainsborough operation from Thomas Ward for £3 million. Marshall Fowler was merged with Aveling Barford to form Aveling Marshall, a maker of crawlers and wheeled loaders run out of the British Leyland Special Products Division, with its headquarters miles away at Melton Mowbray. And now the story tells you exactly what it feels like to become a line item. The men in Gainsborough no longer worked for Marshall. They worked for a division of a subsidiary of a nationalized conglomerate that was, at that very moment, fighting for its own survival in the car market. That fight is what did it. By 1979, British Leyland was hemorrhaging money on its core business and needed cash from anywhere it could find it. So it began shutting and selling the parts that weren't cars. Aveling Marshall was broken up, and the crawler business, the old track Marshall line, the tracked descendant of the field Marshall itself, was bought out of the wreckage by a Lincolnshire farmer and businessman named Charles Nickerson. Remember that name. Because Nickerson was not finished with Marshall. He had just bought the crawlers, and he had rescued a piece of Gainsborough from a distant conglomerate that didn't want it. To the town, it must have looked like a local man bringing a local firm back home. In a small way it was, but Nickerson had a larger idea forming. 3 years later, he would reach for something far bigger, a whole national tractor line, 300 miles away in Scotland, and try to bring that home too. It was the boldest thing anyone had done with the Marshall name in a generation, and it would be the thing that finally killed it. Chapter 9. The name comes home to die. In January 1982, British Leyland's chief executive, Sir Michael Edwards, sold the company's wheeled tractor business, the old Leyland and Nuffield tractor line, built at Bathgate in Scotland, to Charles Nickerson. Bathgate production stopped on the 15th of January. On the 29th, the sale was completed, and Marshall, Sons and Company bought the design and manufacturing rights to the entire Leyland tractor range, reportedly for around £6 million, a figure that included a buffer stock of some 600 completed tractors. Nickerson moved the whole operation to Gainsborough. He rebadged the Leyland tractors as Marshall's, gave them a new gold and black livery he called Golden Harvest, and put them out under the Marshall name. After a quarter of a century, Gainsborough was building wheeled tractors again. The name had come home. To the town, to the local paper, to anyone who remembered the thump of a field marshal across a Lincolnshire field, it looked like a resurrection. In Scotland, it looked like something else entirely, because moving the line to Gainsborough meant taking it away from Bathgate, and Bathgate depended on it. When the work went south, so did the jobs, around 900 of them, gone from a Scottish town nearly 300 miles from where the tractors would now be built. And in the House of Commons, the member for West Lothian rose to say so. Tam Dalyell was not a man who let a thing go quietly. He attacked the sale itself, questioning its probity, calling it a rip-off and a piece of commercial treachery, and accusing the management of having their snouts in the trough. In June 1984, he told the House that the line had been, in his words, bloody well stolen. Gainsborough's own member, Edward Lee, defended the deal, and the Public Accounts Committee cleared it. 2 towns, 2 members, 1 tractor line, and only one of them could keep the work. That is the shape of British industrial decline in a single image, not a villain twirling a moustache, but a job that exists in one place and not another, and a family on each side of the line. But here is the cruelty at the centre of it. Even the town that won, lost, because the tractors Nickerson built at Gainsborough were essentially hand-assembled, and hand assembly is slow and expensive. The firm couldn't build them fast enough or cheaply enough to fund the new models it desperately needed. While Ford and Massey Ferguson poured out modern ranges through the early 1980s, Marshall was making old Leyland designs by hand, one at a time, and losing money on the effort. The revival that was meant to save the name built, in the end, only around 1,000 new tractors before it foundered, and the losses were enormous. According to the record kept by the Marshall Club, the firm went down under heavy losses amounting to £12.5 million, a figure that rests on a single enthusiast source and has never been independently confirmed, but which matches the scale of what happened. In September 1985, Marshall, Sons and Company was put into receivership. The name had come home to Gainsborough, and it had come home only in time to die there. Chapter 10. What the Foundry Left. Receivership is a quiet word for a loud thing. It means the men who kept the books arrive, and the business is taken apart and sold in pieces to whoever will pay. The wheeled tractor side was bought by Bentall Simplex, which moved what was left to a plant at Scunthorpe and traded on as Marshall Tractors Limited, switching to Perkins engines and, in time, importing and rebadging machines built by Steyr and by Ferrari in Italy. The Marshall name survived on a badge, stuck to tractors made elsewhere by other people. It was survival of a kind. It was not the works, and it was not Gainsborough. The crawler side found a truer rescuer. Hubert Flatters had been a Marshall sales director, a company man, someone who knew the place from the inside. He bought the crawler business from the receivers in a management buyout, and on the 3rd of February 1986, crawler production resumed, in a small way, as track marshal of Gainsborough Limited. It was a genuine act of rescue by a man who cared about what he was saving. He had little time to enjoy it. Hubert Flatters died in 1987, within a year of buying the firm he'd saved. His family carried it on. In 1990, it passed to Tom Walkinshaw's TWR Group, which produced a rubber-tracked machine. But by the mid-1990s, the demand for crawlers had collapsed against ever more powerful wheeled tractors, and the business shrank to built-to-order work, then to a sales director named Tony Layton in 1998, and then tractor building at Gainsborough simply stopped, leaving nothing but a spares operation behind it. The long tail of the field marshal, the crawler line that had outlived the tractor that spawned it, finally ran out. And the town? The human cost at Gainsborough is real and, frustratingly, half hidden. At its height, the works had employed something like 5,000 people. As late as 1961, the figure was still over 3,000. Across the British Leyland years and the collapse of 1985, that number bled away. The exact Gainsborough redundancy figures from those final years were never properly gathered into the public record. They survive mainly in the archives of the local paper and in the memory of the town, and the widely quoted figure of 900 jobs belongs to Bathgate, in Scotland, not to Gainsborough at all. It is an honest gap, and there is something fitting in it. The numbers that mattered most to the town were never written down where the country could see them. What is remembered is the ripple. As Marshalls went, the smaller Gainsborough firms that had supplied it for decades suffered and disappeared alongside it. A works that size is never just itself. It is the centre of a web of foundries and suppliers and small engineering shops, and when the centre fails, the web comes down with it. Local memory records it plainly as a difficult time for the town, the kind of understated phrase that carries far more weight than it lets on. And even a quarter of a century after the closure, Gainsborough was still associated, above all other things, with a single name: Marshalls, where the great foundry had stood, where William Marshall had hung the name Britannia over a dead man's yard, where 5,000 people had once poured through the gates, where the single-cylinder diesels had thumped into life on a hammer blow. The machines fell silent, and the town went looking for something new to do with the ground. Chapter 11. The Sound That Won't Die. Walk down Beaumont Street in Gainsborough today, and you will find a shopping centre. It is called Marshall's Yard. The old works site was redeveloped in the middle of the 2000s and opened at Easter 2007, a place of shops and offices, and a gym, a Next, a food store, the ordinary furniture of modern retail. It was named by a local schoolboy, Alex Stevenson, in a competition. The developers were Prospect Estates and Dransfield Properties. The Southworks had become a supermarket. Where the largest engineering complex in the region once stood, people now come to buy their groceries and drink their coffee. But the ground did not forget, and the town did not let it. The main frontage is a Grade 2 listed building, protected since 1989. Above the former main doorway, the original statue of Britannia still stands. The figure William Marshall put over his tiny foundry as a promise, looking down now on the car park and the shop signs, keeping her watch. A preserved steam crane forms the arch over the vehicle entrance, and in September 2023, a National Transport Trust heritage plaque, one of its red wheels, was unveiled on the site by Sir Edward Lee, the same Edward Lee who had stood in the Commons 40 years before defending the deal that brought the name home. He came back to mark what the name had been. And here is the thing about the Field Marshal. It refused to die with the company that built it. Because those machines were built to be nearly unbreakable, thousands of them survived, and their owners will not let them go. Every summer, at vintage rallies across the country, at Newark, at the Great Dorset Steam Fair, that shows the length of Britain, preserved field marshals are the star turns. A crowd gathers. A man turns the flywheel to just the right spot. He lights the smouldering paper and screws it home. He loads the cartridge and shuts the breech. He raises a hammer, and the machine explodes into life exactly as it did in 1947, in a bang and a ring of smoke, and settles into that slow, heavy, unmistakable beat that rocks it gently on its tires. Thump, thump, thump. It still needs the cartridges, and so the cartridges are still made. In Lincolnshire, not far from Gainsborough, the The firm of R.H. Crawford and Sons still handloads the original recipe starting cartridges, so that the preserved machines can go on banging into life at rallies for as long as there are hands to swing the hammer. The Marshall Club and the Gainsborough Heritage Association keep the records and the memory. And on Father's Day, preserved field marshals come back to Marshall's yard itself and thump away on the very ground where they were made, beneath the statue of Britannia, where a woman shopping for a Sunday roast can stop and hear the sound her grandfather worked to. That is the strange, bittersweet ending of it. William Marshall came home to a river town in 1848 and hung an impossible name over a small yard. His sons built it into a giant. The giant gambled on one enormous cylinder and won the love of a nation's farmers with a machine you started by hitting a shotgun cartridge with a hammer, a machine that was, from the very first day, already being made obsolete by a cheap grey tractor and the turn of a simple key. The firm was passed from hand to hand until a local man brought the name home to Gainsborough, at the cost of a Scottish town's work, only to see it fail on the ground where it began. The company is gone. The works is a shopping centre, but the sound is still here. On a summer afternoon, on a patch of Lincolnshire ground, the thump of the field marshal still drifts across the field, the sound of a lost Gainsborough, banging stubbornly on, long after everyone said it should have stopped.